we coordinated our schedules, and Mike, because he still tours with Suicidal, was able to free up that time, and we managed to do that, and that was really fun. We did that in Detroit for the second year of Orion, and then we got an offer from the Whiskey to play, I guess, the final night of the 50-year anniversary of that week. And that was cool because it was a bit more serious. That was like, okay, we're playing LA, we're gonna dive into the set a little deeper, and we actually played a song that we had never ever played live, which is called Infecto Brutalistic, which is always one of my favorite songs that we had recorded with Infectious Grooves, but actually never played. So it was cool to bring that one to life, and we had a lot of fun. I mean, it was really, really a special night for all of us. That's where it really sort of clicked and felt right. And we get a lot of offers now. I think the biggest problem is just scheduling. It's like everybody's schedules are kind of crazy right now.
Jane's Addiction and Suicidal and
and
yours, of course. Yeah.
But it's something we enjoy and we want to do and pursue some more shows.
Yeah. Well, certainly, developed such great experience for you, and then the Ozzy gig comes up. Talk about getting the call and stepping in the shoes. Phil Soussan and Rudy Sarzo and everybody that had laid that foundation. In the Randy Rhoads era. Talk about joining Ozzy.
Well, Ozzy, basically when we recorded the first Infectious Grooves album, we had a song called Therapy. It ended up being that during that time frame that we were recording our album, which was on Epic Records, and Ozzy was recording his album, which was on Epic Records. And coincidentally enough, right down the street from here was Devonshire Studios, where we recorded those albums. The Infectious album, and Ozzy was recording No More Tears, but that's also where Jaco Pastorius recorded with Weather Report. That's where like Heavy Weather was recorded. So it was, but also Earth, Wind and Fire recorded there. It was just a powerful studio with a lot of magic and energy. So with Ozzy kind of in the next room doing his thing, and us, we're almost like living together. You know what I mean? And Ozzy was out of his mind back then. So that's where we initially met him. We asked him our producer, Mark Dodson, asked if he would guest sing on this track Therapy. And, it was always kind of up in the air whether he would or not. And then one night he comes in, just right in the middle of like recording another song, completely different thing. He walks in, he's like, what do you want me to sing? Where's the song? And I was like, what? Where's the song at? Where's the mic? And he's like, oh, okay, we're all like excited, and we set him up with a mic, and he sings the chorus on Therapy, and he loves it. And in fact, it got to the point where every day he would show up in our in our studio, and he would want to hear the song. We kind of have to stop everything. We have to put up the song and then let him hear it, and he'd do this dance where he's kind of, do this whole thing, and he's like, that's the music I want to make and all this, because he loved bass. And but it was wild back then. He was a character. So that's when we first met him. So we finish our album, he finishes his, and the label's setting up the Theater of Madness tour, and that's where basically he's playing all these theaters around the U.S., and this is going to set up his arena tour. So all the shows are already sold out, but they asked, he asked if Infectious Grooves could be the opening band, and we didn't even have a touring band at that time. We basically got some of our friends like Stephen Perkins to play drums on the Infectious record, and Scott Crago, who now plays with the Eagles, to play drums, and Dave Kushner from Velvet Revolver, but back then he was in a band called I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me. But Dave Kushner, he actually played guitar on one of the songs, and Adam Siegel from Excel. So we had all these different characters playing on the album, but we did have a core of musicians that seemed to be more legit. Dean Pleasance We call him Dean the Wah Wah Machine. Was one of those guys. Eventually, Brooks Wackerman joined on the third album. Josh Freese was on the second. So we kind of switched out drummers each album. But he was Ozzy, who demanded that Infectious Grooves open for him.
Yeah.
Our management at the time was kind of like concentrating on Suicidal, but they were like, hey, look, if Ozzy wants you to go on tour with him, we're not going to stand in your way. You know, we can make it happen.
Yeah.
So we did that, and we toured with Ozzy for a month, and that's what kind of planted the seed, I guess, years later, to where actually I got the phone call from Sharon to come down and jam with Ozzy, and I did, you know, and the rest is history. I ended up working with Ozzy for about 7 years. It was fun, you know. We had a good time.
And this was Zach and Joe Holmes?
Joe Holmes was the first phase of my being there. I forget how many years. Joe, you know, I still work with Joe.
Yeah, I see you on the new album, Pharmacology.
Funny thing about that stuff is most of that stuff was recorded before I was in Metallica. So it's like, you know, I give Joe a lot of credit because he's been through about 3 different singers in his journey with Pharmakos, and now he's got Robbie. And you know, he's a character. You know, I've been kind of connected to so many talented musicians, but they're all interesting. And Joe's very special. He's a great friend, actually. But yeah. So I always trip out on that. It's like, you know, there's one song that's on that album that we wrote. It has to be 15 years ago. Yeah, with Benji from Skindred. So anyway, Joe, you know, was in Ozzy's band, and Mike Borden, and this was like a dream kind of scenario for me. We had a lot of fun, and then Zach Wild came back, and I was in there with Zach for a few years, and then I ended up doing a couple things here and there with him, with Black Label Society, but that was also when Zach was out of his mind. You know, completely. I mean, Ozzy and Zach were out of their minds at that time. I always get in these situations with musicians when they're also out of their minds. So,
now,
anyway,
how did you keep level-headed? You know, being around all the craziness.
That, you know what? That's interesting because at a very young age, you know, with my family situation and my dad, who I'm still very tight with, but you know, growing up, Dad was, you know, it's funny because in my situation with him, we always had a good relationship. I was always very careful not to cross him. So in my band situations, I was always very careful how not to cross certain members, because band members can fly off the handle. They can, especially in the situation that some of them were in, whether it was, you know, drug issues, you know, drinking, whatever it was. But, you know, there was a lot of stuff going down, and you had to be cool because, you know, I mean, someone like Zach, I mean, he would snap, you know. I mean, you know, he just would, he'd kind of switch right in front of your eyes. Yeah, you just, you know, so you always kind of had to be careful with these people. And as part of the journey, and I think with that, I adopted patience and, you know, respect. Just, you know, learn how to deal with people and their personalities the best way that I can and could in those different situations.
And you'd seen the downside of drugs and alcohol, so you kind of balanced it all.
Yeah, exactly. I was fortunate to not get wrapped up too hard in anything that was too dangerous, because it was all out there, you know, in the late 80s and in the 90s. It was definitely, you know, it was, you know,
common practice.
It was all happening, you know.
Yeah.
And I, for some reason, maybe it was my mom or something, but I was able to kind of power my way through it, but still enjoy the music and the positive side of being creative with a lot of these wonderful musicians that I've been blessed with, you know, over the years.
That was the main thing, the music, so you never let anything else get in the way of that.
Correct. You know, I mean, basically at a certain point, you know, I mean, you go through that phase where, you know, you're going to bed at 9 in the morning and just wild, man. I mean, when I started playing with Suicidal, it was '89, so kind of '89, and then the early '90s. There were a lot of clubs, a lot of different types of clubs. In the '80s, you had a lot of cool punk clubs. In the '90s, you had a lot of interesting alternative clubs like English Acid, Scream, Cat House.
Yeah.
Was Ricky Rackman's whole thing was going on.
Right.
All that stuff. I guess Bordello was an extension of that. So there was always something going on. And the cool thing back then is bands would come into town, and actually play a show at like English Acid or something, small show, whether it was Social Distortion or, Danzig, Suicidal. We had done one. I think Primus for Mercy and Primus, Rage Against the Machine. Just that's kind of how it was. It was a part of the scene. So there was always something going on, and it was fun. We had good times. It was wild. But at a certain point, I think in your career, as you get older, you want to still keep your game on and be able to play and write and be creative. And I think there's an adjustment. For me, I discovered surfing more, and I started getting more into surfing and thinking to myself, well, I'd rather be healthy. I'd rather wake up at 7 in the morning and go catch waves than go to bed at 7 and have a hangover, wake up at 3. So at some point, there was that transition.
Find a balance. It would help the music.
Yeah, so that I could, still be creative and have fun doing it.
Sure.
But again, that's when I also met Metallica, was through touring with Suicidal Tendencies and opening for Metallica in '93. So it was all kind of happening around the same time. Infectious Grooves, my introduction to Metallica, Ozzy, it's just, even meeting Jerry Cantrell back then, and Suicidal Tendencies. We opened for Alice in Chains in Australia, and I think that was the last tour that Alice in Chains had sort of officially done. Before they kind of sort of didn't part ways, but kind of subsided a bit.
So with Ozzy, obviously you got the experience of the bigger halls, the arenas, the festivals.
Right.
You stepped it up, and the big headline shows with the production and all that, Talk about, getting the call from Metallica, because obviously you were still employed with Ozzy at the time,
Correct.
Talk about, getting that offer and kind of making that transition.
Well, basically, Jason had left the band, and there was kind of a couple years there where it was fairly quiet. And I was working with Ozzy, but I was also working with Zakk Wylde a little bit, and he had some stuff brewing, like a Japan tour or stuff like that. I had done a couple things in the States with him, and I got a call. A mutual friend of mine who worked for Metallica actually called me to go surfing with Kirk. Now, I had met Kirk 10 years before, when Suicidal, when we opened for Metallica on the Black Album, and it's like, Kirk and I are going to come down to LA, and we're driving an RV down there, can you take us to some of the local surf spots? And I was like, heck yeah. So Kirk came out for a week, and they camped out over in Manhattan Beach, and we surfed out Porto, we surfed County Line, surfed Zuma, I think it was, and talked a lot about surfing and a little bit about music. It didn't even really come up, the situation with Jason and the bass player and all that. We were just really vibing on hanging at the beach and surfing. And then a few months roll by, maybe 6 months actually. I was on a surf trip in Tahiti, and I'm checking my voicemail, and it's Lars and Kirk, and they're like, "Hey, come on out, come up, jam with us, check out Metallica and all this." And I was like, whoa, just out of nowhere, left field. And long story short, I was actually flying back to L.A. and I had to go to Mike Borden. Mike Borden is the drummer for Faith No More, but he was also the drummer for Ozzy at that time. It was his 40th birthday party, so I was actually going to fly to San Francisco to go to his birthday party, which also then sort of coincided with in the timeline where I could come down and see the Metallica guys. So it's kind of killing two birds with one stone. So Lars is going, well, if you're going to be in San Francisco on Saturday, now mind you, it's like Wednesday, you know, he's going, well, yeah, I'm getting into town on Friday and then I'm going to this party. Well, then you could come jam with us on Monday. Yeah, you might as well just stay, you know. So I ended up, with very little short notice, going to audition with them on that Monday. And it was like a 2-day audition. The playing part of it, performance part, was actually on a Tuesday. And that's kind of how that kicked off, you know. And, I'd spent a fair amount of time in the Bay Area because of Mike, and he was you know, really great, still a great friend of mine. So, you know, I'd go up there, I'd crash out in his guest room or his couch or whatever, and that sort of parlayed its way into auditioning for Metallica.
So you already knew the guys, it was all kind of familiar territory, it wasn't a huge transition, you just kind of slid right in and learned the songs.
It's interesting because I hadn't seen the guys in like 10 years. I mean, you know, when I went out and toured with Jerry Cantrell, Lars had shown up at a couple of those gigs, and we played up north. You know, Lars and Jerry were really good friends. So I think that kind of, my connection to Kirk through surfing, and then Lars kind of checking me out a little bit through Jerry. You know, he enjoyed the album that Jerry and I made together, Degradation Trip album, and then he saw us play a couple times. So there was a little bit there, and then of course going a little further back with Suicidal Tendencies. You know, James remembered me from that, and because we were together for a while back then, you know, in the early '90s. You know, I guess when you're looking for a permanent member, you kind of gotta look at your history with that player and their personality and their style and see if it's a possibility, you know, because they checked out a lot of guys. But
yeah, I mean the playing's got to be there, but you got to live with the guy.
You got to live with the guy, and you gotta trust. You gotta, you know, Metallica's a very challenging universe. You know, there's a lot of last minute,
a lot of demands.
Yeah, situations, and there's always pressure, so you can't really fold. I had to learn so much music that first year, and then I had to learn the new songs from Saint Anger, which had never been played really with the band, and you know, it was an interesting time. You know, at that time I didn't have kids, I wasn't married, so I was able to kind of move up to the Bay Area for the most part, and even though I still had my place in LA, but just dive into what I needed to do for them. And even then, it was still, I look back and that first year was loose for me. It was like really, I go, oh man. You know, but at a certain point I was able to catch up and kind of figure it out. But first year was definitely a difficult journey for me.
Yeah. Well, what's so amazing is that the band's come full circle, and you guys are essentially an indie band. You run your own record label, got your own operation and everything. And I always tell people that's, you know, inspiration to do it yourself. What advice do you give to the musician that shouldn't be necessarily waiting for a deal or somebody else to do it for them, but the impetus to get in there and start growing their own?
Well, you know, we're fortunate in this day and age to where we have the ability through the internet to promote. I'm not saying necessarily Metallica. I'm just saying in general your art.
Yeah.
You know, your music, your business, whatever it is, independently and present it to the world. You know, and the downside is everybody's there to target you and all that. But the upside is you can create your fan base. You can win people over, and you know, I've always felt that in my mind, my spirit, and the energy of what I do, like Infectious Grooves, even though we were signed to Epic Records, we were pretty much an independent band because Epic didn't care about Infectious Grooves. I mean, they
Yeah.
cared about the money band, which was Suicidal Tendencies. That's where their investment was.
Yeah.
That's where they needed to kind of make money back on, whether it was recording budget or promotional budget, whatever. Infectious Grooves, there was no very, very little budget, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
back then, you know, I think we made our first album for. I mean, maybe now it seems like a lot of money, but back then, it was like something like 75. Maybe it was like a $75,000 budget, like all encompassing or whatever. So we had to kind of make it all work with that, and they didn't promote it. I remember handing out flyers, but there's also something rewarding about that, you know.
Mhm.
But I remember I had a hernia operation. No, ruptured appendix operation, ruptured. So I was, you know, fresh out of the hospital, and I'm handing out flyers at the Palace, at the Roxy, because we had a gig, you know, coming up. I think it was actually at the Roxy. And it was like earning your stripes again, you know, hitting the pavement. Because there was, management didn't care really at the time. I mean, they were there to help when they needed to, but overall it was like kind of like, if we wanted to do this, we had to take it on ourselves and promote our own gigs. Even though Golden Voice was there to do that. You know, here's a box of flyers.
Yeah.
Do what you got to